All right, hello and welcome everybody. I've got something for you today that I think I'm going to call something like free speech needs decentralization. Because that's kind of my final conclusion, but I've got a lot to go into before we get to it. And actually, this is my second attempt at this video because the first time I did it, I just missed a bunch of topics that I wanted to touch on. So let's just get right into it. Lately, it seems like governments have been attacking free speech more and more. We've got criminalization of a lot of different types of speech in the UK, including just like reposting something on social media that someone pretends that they find offensive. We have the arrest of Pavel Durov in France. He's the CEO, I think he's the CEO of Telegram, and they arrested him because they claim that some people are doing bad things on Telegram and he won't give the French government a back door into Telegram. And so they basically said, well, now you're responsible for these crimes that you have no part in actually committing. And it's important to remember that privacy is like a thing that we had for a long time before social media became ubiquitous and electronic surveillance became ubiquitous, right? Like people were able to say things to each other in private, and sometimes, yeah, it would be hard to get, evidence to convict someone of something. And the solution is not to give government backdoors into every bit of encryption, and I'm going to explain why in a minute. But before I do that, I also want to mention that the current U.S. vice presidential candidate said, quote, there is, quote, no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech. And this is also a serious, red flag as far as it goes. And, let's get to why. Number one, this is just lazy policing. It's basically, if we can't get the right man, we'll torture somebody. We got to torture somebody for this. And the process is the punishment. It's important to note that mens rea is an important part of, legal traditions because it means that, you're as long as you're not trying to do the criminal thing, you shouldn't be liable for it. By happenstance, creating circumstances that allow someone else without your knowledge to do a criminal thing is not the same thing and doesn't, generally speaking, reflect on you at least in a criminal manner, and that's good. That's an important cornerstone of common law. The question that we have to ask ourselves is: can we trust the government to have these surveillance powers that they so greedily want? And the answer, in my opinion, is no. And, number one is, well, they're a coercive state. They're a gang of thugs, and this is something that they want. And you never give gangs of thugs things that they want, because usually they're going to use them against you. What will a government do with these kinds of surveillance powers? Well, they'll harass and chill any political opposition. They can, it's true already that these simple electronic records are pretty easily spoofed and pretty easily turned into basically an entrapment tool for government. They want to catch you on some crime, and so they create an electronic record that makes it look like you did something that gives them the opportunity to get a warrant and take you down. It's important to remember that, I think I said this already, but the process is the punishment. The government has an infinite amount of dollars to spend on lawyers trying to get you, and they don't. And it's not like they, find that cost to be a strain to them, right? It just gives their lawyers more things to gleefully work on, basically. And the thing that I want to make note of here is that it makes no sense to give government both political power on one hand and the authority to decide truth on the other hand. We have systems in place to avoid that, like jury trials, right? Police can and will lie on the stand to get their man, right? And that's why we have juries and not just have the judge say, well, the police says this, the police officer said this, and we got to believe that. No, you need actual people who are not interested, personally in the outcome of the trial to determine who is lying and why, because just saying an oath doesn't mean anything, especially to police, especially in the U.S. There's that old trope, that cliche that, the Second Amendment defends the First Amendment, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. In fact, they both protect each other. The fact that it's still legal to say in the U.S., this is my tyrant shooting gun, is something that is very important, because once they say that you can't say that anymore, it becomes fairly easy for the government to say, oh, well, you also it also can take away your ability to counter the idiots online or anywhere who claim that the Second Amendment only defends a militia right, or it's about hunting, or any other nonsense like that. No, the Second Amendment is about shooting tyrants, and the fact that we're still allowed to say this means that we haven't lost the fight yet, but they're trying to take away things bit by bit, and here's a roadmap. So, as a lot of these, progressive authoritarian roadmaps work, they start with something actually fairly reasonable. Let's take a look at the fighting words doctrine. The fighting words doctrine is something that is related to self-defense. Basically, if someone tells you, I'm going to hurt you right now, and that under certain circumstances, if it appears possible, for instance, that they can make good on that statement, you're in a situation where self-defense, for force in self-defense, is now, at least conceivable that a jury would say, oh yeah, you were acting in self-defense. He said, I'm going to kill you, and he had a knife. Well, you don't need to wait to be stabbed. You don't need to wait to be shot to defend yourself against that kind of thing. And so fighting words doctrine is a real thing that actually has real use. You can make a legitimate self-defense case based on someone's words and, some circumstances of their physical condition, and you don't need to necessarily accept an injury before you can defend yourself. This is reasonable. This is something that juries and courts can look at and examine the circumstances. Of course, if you're in a house alone with someone and you say, he said he was going to kill me, and, when they find you, you're the only one with a weapon, and the other guy is, half your size, and the bullet wounds come in from the back, that's not going to generally convince a jury that was a self-defensive act. But the notion that you don't have to wait to be harmed, that words themselves can be they can open the gates to self-defense, to self-defensive force, is actually legitimate, and it's something that can be used correctly and can be used incorrectly and can be used by unscrupulous people to justify violence that they wanted to commit, in the presence of sympathetic witnesses, for instance. But here's what government does. What they do, the first step is to turn hate speech into fighting words. It is true that in certain circumstances, you could take certain words, certain slurs to be meant as fighting words when they aren't actually, immediate, imminent threats. Again, this is something that courts and juries have to decide and kind of look at the circumstances, but simply making the utterance of particular words equivalent to fighting words is the first step, because what it allows them to do next is claim that those same words, when uttered through some medium where no aggression is actually possible, right? That if I put that word in a newspaper and print it, or in a letter and send it somewhere, that also counts as aggression, which now we're getting further away. The fighting words doctrine requires the threat to be imminent and present, and now we've expanded the definition of what fighting words are to name-calling, and then we've also expanded the definition of what counts as aggression to things that are not imminent and not proximal, not nearby. So that's step one. Once the government does that, they can now make hate speech unlawful because it's aggression, right? And since it's aggression, well, then you can be prosecuted for it, even if there's no actual physical force that follows from it. This is where, actually it's a little worse than this in the UK, because the next step is to expand the definition of hate speech to include anything that's offensive at all. Again, this is something where, reasonable people can make reasonable judgments about these things, but simply saying now anything that is offensive is now effectively aggression from a legal perspective basically opens the floodgates. Once that's true, the government can take total control of speech because something is offensive to everybody. And the expanding the definition of hate speech to offensive is where Britain is right now. They've now said that anything that you say that makes somebody uncomfortable somewhere on the internet counts as a crime, which is the same thing as calling it which is basically trying to lump it in with aggression. The people still don't quite believe it's aggression, but this is one of those problems that happens, that as free speech gets clamped down, the distinction between like positive law, between the laws that are passed by the government, and right and wrong get muddled. They get kind of mixed together, and people can no longer really tell the difference between the two. It's also worth noting that at every single step in this process, unequal treatment, unequal enforcement can be used by the government to make things worse. So, if the government decides that only certain types of hate speech are enforceable, then you have a group that can lobby to give itself more power from the government. So we can see that via this roadmap, you go from something reasonable, like fighting words, step by step by step by step, into total government control of speech and criminalization of anything that anyone finds offensive. And of course, the government can be offended, or that is to say, agents of the government can be offended, and then they can use that against people. It's basically the total loss of freedom of speech. And it can happen, as we can see, in these little steps. People give up their rights bit by bit and don't even realize it a lot of the time. So, what do we need to fight this? Well, we've already got some good tools, right? We have encryption, especially end-to-end encryption, where, nothing leaves you that isn't encrypted, and nothing leaves the person you're talking to that isn't also encrypted. That makes it much harder for government to intercept, because they can only intercept encrypted parts. They don't ever get a look at unencrypted bits of stuff. We need stuff to be open source, so that anti-government third parties can examine the code and make sure that there aren't any backdoors included, and so that they can separately compile the code so that they can confirm that the compiled version that's being distributed is the same as the compiled version that comes from that code, right? These are both important steps. Telegram fails the open source step because it's closed source. That means that if Pavel Durov, upon being arrested, decided to give the government the ability to have a backdoor into Telegram, we would never know about it. The only way that would work is that someone in a position of knowledge would leak to the public that, hey, there's a backdoor in Telegram now and you can't trust it. Basically, you need something like this to be open source so that it can be examined by disinterested third parties. But what we also need, it is becoming clear, is we need something that's decentralized. We need something where, you can have a bit of it on your computer and send a message to someone else, and they can get it on their computer without there being a central server that everything is routed through. And this is the hard part. It's actually not the hard part, because you personally can get encryption software. You can put it on your computer. You can encrypt a text message, or whatever you want, send it to someone, and you can, arrange between the two of you to share that password through some secure means, right? Whenever there's a central server, they can take the owner of that server and they can prosecute him, which makes it so that people who own servers, or people who own various types of software, are more likely to side with the government just out of self-interest, basically. So decentralization is the next step. We need to make it so that there's no centralized person for the governments to torture and prosecute based on people's desire for actual privacy. And the final thing that I'm going to talk about is a little bit technical, but I'll keep it minimal, is protocol flexibility. The government is constantly trying to figure out loopholes or methods by which it can crack various types of encryption. They're dumping huge amounts of money into groups that are designing quantum computers, because quantum computation is a very strong weapon against current classical encryption methods. On the bright side, it's much easier for classical encryptors to increase the number of bits that they use to encrypt something than it is for the government to increase by a similar proportion the number of quantum bits or qubits that exist in their quantum computers. And so for the time being, classical encryption can be kept safe by simply expanding the encryption keys faster than the government can expand quantum bits in their decryption machines. But basically, the other thing that any protocol needs, right? Encryption, open source, decentralized, protocol flexibility. All of these things need to exist in whatever tool people end up using in order to actually provide a good defense against government anti-encryption efforts. And, privacy and free speech go hand in hand, because one part of free speech is being able to speak anonymously, to say things that the government and its agents would love to persecute you for, and have it be difficult for them to know who said it. So yeah, hopefully we'll see some brilliant software engineers create a tool that has all of these things in some kind of easily usable package that regular people can get a hold of and use themselves. Hopefully this kind of decentralization especially will prevent governments from finding someone to prosecute, to torture, to produce backdoors and keys, and when it's open source, the government can create a fork and then distribute that fork, which has a backdoor. That's one of the downside. That's one of the kind of double edges of open source, and it means that people need ways to figure out how to look at this stuff. It's a tough problem because at first glance it appears to require a lot more technical understanding from the average person than most people are willing to throw at this kind of thing. But that's kind of the hope, is that somebody will figure out how to put all these things together in such a way that it becomes more difficult for government to break privacy and suppress free speech. But that's where we're at right now. We've got governments attacking free speech all over the place. We've got them marching down this roadmap to complete control of speech and complete criminalization of anything that they don't like getting out there, including criticism of themselves. We know that governments can't be trusted with the authority to decide what is true and what is untrue. And we know that the ability to speak freely is integral into maintaining, legal barriers like the Second Amendment in a meaningful form for people to defend their speech with. It's not just one way. It's a freaking, circle. These things both affect each other. So with that, I think I've got enough for you guys today. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found this informative. I hope that the roadmap is helpful. And of course, I'll have a copy of the roadmap on my blog where you can take a look at that. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments, I'd love to hear them. Anything that you want to do to help spread the word, greatly appreciative. And thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.